McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Do Texas taxpayers need to be spending more money on our K-12 schools? And does more money equal better student outcomes? What is the true state of education in Texas schools compared to others around the country that spend more? What about our property tax controversy? And finally, how do you feel about incentive pay for teachers? Well, hopefully I have your attention if you're a taxpayer or a parent or a student. So let's meet the experts who can help us understand all these issues. And first, on my left, Professor Stan Leibowitz. He teaches economics at the Jindal School of Management, the University of Texas at Dallas, where he's also involved with the Colloquium for the Advancement of Free Enterprise Education. He's written 5 books and dozens of academic articles, plus writing for the Reason magazine and the Wall Street Journal. And Stan, you recently published something in this K-12 education rankings, and I saw that, I think, in Reason magazine, and I think the whole thing was done for Cato, is that right?
That's right. The long version was for Cato, the more academic version. Reason did a 3-page, 5-page version of it. Also made it a cover story. So
yeah. Well, and of course, I read the abstracts, so there we are. So thank you very much for the short version. And sitting next to you, Dr. David Vrunland. He's currently serves as superintendent of schools for the Mesquite Independent School District. During his 33 years of service in education, he's taught in Texas, Maryland, and Japan, in districts ranging from fast to low growth and from property wealthy to property poor, giving him a lot of perspectives on school funding. So David, welcome to the program.
Thank you, it's very good to be here.
There is a very good chance that that viewer does not really know much about the factual situation on school funding in Texas, in spite of the fact that it's in the newspapers almost every day, especially with the legislature in session now. Give us some history, if you will, about what this is all about and why we have this continuing controversy over funding.
Well, if I may, I want to kind of go back a little bit and just understand our purpose. I think you always have to start with that in mind. And Thomas Jefferson in 1810 wrote of public education, or a general education. Its purpose was to enable every man to determine for himself that which will secure or endanger their freedom. I think as we look at what we try to do, we have to always keep that in mind. I think in today's world, we seem to center around college and career readiness, and there's nothing wrong with that, mind you. But I think in the long run, we have to recognize that there's both a corporate interest, if you will, in public education, how we're going to do as a whole, but also individually, how we're working to advance children so that they're in control of the quality of their freedom when they graduate from our high schools and move on into whatever, prospective opportunities they have in life. I think today what has happened has been an interesting transition from our beginnings. I mean, you got to go back. We really are fairly new at this. I mean, it seems like a long time in terms of perspective, but you got to realize that it was not until the 1890s that we started even designing the system we're in today, and we didn't even start really kind of putting it in place until after World War II. So, I mean, there's just a lot that's been going on. One of the things that happened in Texas that's not similar in every state, however, is we shifted rather from an income tax system to pay for public schools. We went to a property tax system. And that may have seemed like a good idea. I would argue, just from my perspective, that's a regressive tax process, and it hurts the middle class probably more than anyone else. But what ends up happening is that we fund our public schools through two basic buckets. A state bucket where they collect dollars through various taxes, business taxes and oil and all that kind of stuff, sales taxes. And then at our level, it's strictly property tax. We've had problems over the last many years, and I really want to go back to '06 when they compressed the tax rate. They compressed the M&O tax rate from $1.50 to $1 in '06.
That compressed what kind of rate now?
We were at $1.50 for maintenance and operation.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that. I do that pretty easily.
It sounded like a railroad, but right? I'm not sure. Right?
It feels like a railroad sometimes.
Right.
But the tax rate was compressed, and the state said they would guarantee the difference. At the time, the state was probably around 57% of the contribution to public schools, and then the rest was localized dollars, generalized across the state, obviously. Then in '09, and we were warned by this by our comptroller at the time, Carol Keaton Strayhorn, she warned us about this. She said the dollars will not be there. to fulfill the difference between the compressed tax rate and what we were doing. She was actually right. There was about a $5 billion loss, and the only thing that saved us was the stimulus money from the Obama administration in 2009. It filled that bucket. But then in 2011, those monies weren't there anymore, and we had a $5 billion hole.
All right, let me stop you there for a second. I want you to finish that. But why weren't the monies there?
Because the economy wasn't turning. As you know, it was right around 2008 where the economy started turning, and we had a downturn in the economy. And so when
so property values went down, property taxes
slowed.
went down.
Yeah, they slowed.
But the state wasn't funding because of their tax issues as well?
Correct. And the system wasn't structured to collect taxes. They had reduced a lot of their means for collecting taxes. And as I said, the comptroller at the time knew that was going to happen. What has been difficult is since that time, we still haven't recovered those monies fully. Of course, this session, as you know, House Bill 3, we likely will recover those dollars finally and then some. But what ended up happening was as our property values went up in our local districts, including Mesquite ISD, the 3 years I've been in Mesquite ISD, we've almost averaged 10% a year in value increases. We've had some great economic influence into the city of Mesquite, including Ashley Furniture and some other big box kind of things. And so it's been a good boon to our economy, but it's forced our taxpayers to have to pay more. And you would think, well, then the school district should be able to lower.
We should have plenty of money then, right?
We should have plenty of money.
But
the state, in equal part, reduced their share to us. And so we end up essentially flat. We get a few more dollars, but it's not enough to account for increases in health care. It's not enough to account for increases in inflation. It's not enough to account for increases in resource costs. I mean, significant problems for school districts because the state essentially is reducing their share as the local property taxpayer is increasing their share.
And why is that?
It's the way the system's designed. And that's not even Robin Hood. We're not a recapture district, so don't misunderstand that as Robin Hood. We get more dollars from the state than we get from our local taxpayer. But the result is my taxpayer is looking at me going, wait a minute, I'm paying more. Why can't you reduce it? And it's because essentially the state takes away their equal share.
All right, now you mentioned Robin Hood. As last I checked, that was a book and probably several movies that we made.
It does involve theft.
There's probably one viewer who's saying, Robin Hood, why are we talking about Robin Hood? We did a television program on Robin Hood maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago.
Right.
I mean, what is Robin Hood? You guys get money, but let's just take Plano and Frisco. I assume they probably give it. So tell us about that.
It's recapture, really, in the way we talk about it. But out on the street, everyone calls it Robin Hood. It's basically taking from the rich and giving to the poor districts. It's a redistribution of the dollars through the taxing system is what it amounts to. And so Plano has to give X amount of dollars, and I honestly don't know their formula, but they have to give X amount of dollars back to the state, which is then redistributed out. But here's the thing that the local taxpayers don't understand and should really bother them. Even though I'm not recapture, essentially I am, as I just explained to you, as my tax values go up, the state simply reduces their share to the tune across the state last biennium of $3.5 billion. And that did not go back into public ed. So they're recapturing it and using it for the purposes of general fund rather than into public ed. And that has been a frustration point for superintendents and school boards across the state of Texas. The end result has been, since 2006, we've really only increased spending roughly, and increase is not the right term, but about a rate of about 2%, give or take.
A year?
And actually, in
Which
inflationary,
is not much different from the inflation rate.
It's actually less. In inflationary costs, we actually are $200 less per student this year than we were in 05-06.
Yeah, interesting. Now, Stan, we've heard a similar story at the University of Texas at Dallas, haven't we, about monies?
That's right. The UT system, all the state schools used to get a lot more of their revenue from the state. And the state's been cutting back for a very long time. And the universities tend to make it up by charging higher tuitions, higher fees. And so the state has less financial impact than it used to.
Right. Now, why is it, Stan? I mean, this is not something that you and I talked about ahead of time, but it almost seems to me has something in common with the welfare system. So the welfare folks, some people get welfare because of their income, et cetera, and then as their income goes up, the amount of benefits that they get go down, and so there's no incentive. You know what I mean there? Does that make any sense?
Well, I understand that there's the welfare system tends to cause problems where people have no incentive to work because they'll wind up losing so many benefits that the extra money from working basically disappears.
Correct.
And so that gives them the wrong incentive. So when you're setting up a welfare system, you don't want to set it up that way.
Correct.
I'm not sure whether that's completely applicable to what's going on with the universities. And I don't know how it would necessarily apply to the K through 12 in terms of the impact. You can make an argument as to the state shouldn't be subsidizing universities that much, because if you want, you can make the argument, because universities tend to have students above average income. All right, and so you're subsidizing those who can pay themselves. And so a system that would subsidize more effectively would be one where you're giving more scholarships to the poor students, but making the students who can afford to pay a higher tuition. And so a lot of the subsidy that went on with paying for universities was to upper middle class students. And it's not clear that the state should be paying for that.
Right. Now, what is the rationale, David, for having tax money to support your schools anyway? And if you can make that rationale, why is it that the state of Texas gets a lot of bad press for not continuing to fund education of all things, which is what, as you said, most people think is the most important thing?
Right, and actually our rationale goes back to our nation's history. It starts with the Northwest Ordinance, and it's how we advance the general welfare of this nation is by educating its populace, and that is something that the whole of the nation needs to take on, not just the individuals who have kids in the system. Right, that's not the way it was designed to be. If we were to do a pay-or-use kind of system where taxpayers weren't actually funding that, I think you'd have a dangerous situation in terms of advancing the cause of representative democracy in this nation, which would concern me greatly, and advancing Jefferson's cause. And so I think that's the rationale for why we use a system of taxpayer-funded schools.
I'm going to get to Stan's arguments here in a minute, but you brought up something. I mean, are you teaching civic education anymore? You used to teach,
absolutely.
Are you sure?
With a passion.
Are you
Yes,
sure?
With
I mean, the students that I get, I don't know about the ones he get. They don't know where Washington, D.C. is. They think it's somewhere on the Brazos. I don't know.
Well, that's a product of the standardization movement, which that's a whole other conversation. I'd
Is
love
that
to
a
come back
Common
on
Core
your show
issue?
and have
That's
a conversation
whole other
about
issue. Okay.
But,
are you teaching economic education?
We are. Actually, students are required to take basically 2 economics kind of courses. Regular general economics, that's a requirement of their graduation. And then you have a new thing, basic finance. It's part of the state requirements.
And so Speaker Pelosi wants to lower the voting age to 16. Good idea or not, based on your
Not so
students?
much. No, I would not concur with that idea.
Okay, good. Just checking it out. Want to make sure where you stand on that. Now, Stan, the study that you did, people, and David hadn't talked about it a lot, but you hear it in the national media, hear it here, that we need to have more money in schools, and that Texas is just not funding its schools right. So where does Texas fall in terms of per student expenditures about?
Pretty low. I don't have the exact number on.
I have 40 seconds. That
You have
sound
40
about
seconds?
right?
That sounds.
It depends on which service you're looking at.
All right,
Yeah,
good.
close enough.
And so all the folks in education, like David and all his cohorts, want to go down to Austin to get more because they say it's 40 seconds. So consequently, if we're spending 40, if we're spending 40 seconds, our education must be that same low quality too. Yes or no?
That's what a lot of people assume. It's not correct, however.
It's not correct.
No, it's not.
Why is it not correct?
Well, we have a way of trying to assess whether or not students are learning in their classes. And if you take a look at the scores that students earn on the tests that are not tests that teachers are teaching to, but that are tests that measure how much the students know, then it turns out Texas is doing a pretty good job, much better than you would think based on the amount of expenditure. Now, there's another factor as well, which is that the Texas has lower cost of living, and so you should at least adjust the expenditures by the cost of living in different states. And when you do that, Texas winds up spending more than it would seem because that is a lower than average cost of living. But independent of how much it's spending, its students do very well on these tests when you take a look at who it is that's taking the tests. And that's what's missing from most of the national rankings. So you'll find a lot of pundits, Paul Krugman, for example, who likes to pick on Texas. And he likes to pick on Texas because Texas doesn't spend a lot of money, and he believes Texas students do very poorly. And he says Texas should spend more money. He's against people who want to save taxes and not have greater government. So he points to Texas, and he says Texas doesn't do very well. And if you look at the average score of the Texas students, they don't seem to be terribly high. But the problem is Texas students have many more minorities than other states that do much better than Texas. So one of them would be Iowa, for example.
Okay, now wait a minute. Where are you from originally, David?
That would be Iowa.
Iowa. Okay, just want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Okay, so Iowa, you did this study between Texas and Iowa, is that right?
Right. Well, actually, I look at all the states and D.C. Now, the worst examples, the biggest differences are in New England. I'll come back to Iowa in a minute. But you have a state like Maine. It does very well on the national rankings, and Vermont, and New Hampshire. But their students, they have a very small minority population, almost all white students. And they get very high average scores compared to other states. But if you break down and say, how do the students in Maine do who are white compared to Texas whites? How do the Iowa white students compared to Texas white students? Texas does better than both of them. And in fact, it does better than almost all the other states. And it turns out Texas does very well with black students. It does well with Hispanic students. It does well with Asian students. And so when you say, how does Texas do breaking it down student group by student group, Texas is actually number 5 in the country. And not 40th, which you might think on expenditure. It's very good.
I think we'll send a copy of this program to Paul Krugman. So I'm gonna ask him to put graphic number 2 up there, and then ask you to tell us what this means. It's a little bit hard to see at home, perhaps, and I'll blow it up in just a minute. But what do you see on this thing? What's on the left and what's on the right? Are we trying to look at here?
I did try to make the names of those states, the fonts as big as possible, without having them lay on top of one another. On the vertical axis, you have how well the students do in a particular state on the exams, how much they know. On the horizontal axis, you have how much the state is spending. So the best states, the states that are getting the most bang for the buck, are in the northwest quadrant.
Oh, northwest quadrant. Okay, let's blow that up with graphic 3 now. See if, yes, now let's look at that quadrant right there. Now
Right.
talk to us about that. You can see Texas a whole lot better there.
Right, and you can see Florida, which is the furthest to the northwest there, and it's actually number 1 in terms of how much bang you're getting for the buck. But Virginia is also very high, and Texas is very high. They're right behind. Virginia's number 2, Texas is number 3. Those are the states that are doing the best job for the least amount of money. If you just look vertically, you can see Virginia is slightly higher. Their students do the best. And Massachusetts is the one northeast state that continues to actually do well when you adjust for the type of students. New Jersey also does okay, but New Jersey spends a ton of money. Massachusetts doesn't spend that much. So Massachusetts turns out to be number 10 when you control for how much they're spending and how well their students are doing. But all the other top northeast states, drop like crazy. So Maine drops from out of the top 10 to like number 46, and Vermont drops like a stone, and you get a very different story. The story that you get if you read U.S. News and World Report, or if you look at any of the other national rankings, is the Northeast has the best students and the best systems, and Upper Midwest has some good ones too. But when you control for the type of students, it turns out the South and the Southwest states are the majority of the top states, not the New England states.
That is shocking to a lot of people. We will get this information to somebody else. Let's look at graphic number 4 and see what that tells us.
Okay, so the right-hand column is the U.S. News and World Report ranking. And
You see the state of Iowa on there. I just want to point that out.
That's right. I haven't come back to Iowa yet. But one example would be Iowa does very well. And if you compare Iowa to Texas, and you look at the average of the scores, and this particular exam gives 4th grade and 8th grade,
right.
and it gives a bunch of different tests. It's usually math and reading, and we also included science. And so there's 24. There's 2 grades, and there's 3 exams, so that's 6. And then you get 4 each, so it's 24. If you do, and you look at Iowa on average does better. But when you break it down and you look at every exam, Texas beats Iowa on 20 of the 21 exams they have in common.
Well, I got here quick.
And yet Iowa is ranked so much more highly than Texas. It's insane.
Well, and if I may, and you can't argue the rankings in terms of the way they're parsed out here. And we've talked about this in public ed for a long time, that when you break things down by demographics, Texas actually does quite well. And the other thing I'd like to point out that I think is important for the viewer to hear, it's not just on NAEP scores. We're graduating more kids than we ever have in our nation's history. we're sending more kids on to universities than we ever have in our nation's history. I know we complain about the number of kids who don't graduate from the university when they go on, but we're graduating more than we have in our nation's history. We have still the greatest economy, and I remember growing up, it was all about Japan where I worked, you know, how we were going to lose to Japan. Well, we saw what happened there. And before me, back in the 60s, it was how Russia was going to just kill us, and we saw what happened there.
And now we got China. I'm really nervous.
And yeah, really nervous, right? Although they do have billions of people, so that might have an impact on the GDP. But my point is this, is from a corporate standpoint, there's no question we're doing better. Meeting the vision of Jefferson, getting a 60 by 30 that our Finance Commission just proposed, we've got a lot of work to do. That requires an investment, especially investment in teacher quality. And it's not about trying to do better than New York City in expenditure. It really is not. It's not even for me about comparing from one state to another state how much money we're spending. It's about ensuring that we're getting the level of teacher quality that we need in our system to ensure that we're taking all of our children to a place where they can control the quality of their freedom. And we are not there yet. We're not even close. And I want to point this out because I think it's really important to understand this. When we started investing heavily in the early 2000s in reading academies in our state, we not only saw the NAEP scores go up, we saw all sorts of climbing going on. And then in 2007, we stopped the funding of reading academies. That's an investment in the quality of teachers. And when that happened, we saw a decline immediately in the performance of students. We've got to reinvest back into the system. The other thing that concerns me, frankly, is not starting teacher pay. That's good. It's roughly $52,000 to $54,000 in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It's fantastic. It takes 20 years to get to 60. That is not fantastic. So we're losing teachers significantly in the early years, both due to the standardization and over-testing that we're seeing, but also the simple economics. And then, if I may, the other piece of this that I think is really, really important to kind of keep in mind is that we are now at a 40-year low in people going into education. 50% across the nation to 60% in some places of the teachers that are coming into our system are alternative certified, which means that they have not gone through a traditional program that I think anyone with a degree of sense knows that that's a good culling process to make sure that people are actually prepared for our classrooms. Right. So there's some concerns here, and that's why we are really pushing more for increased funding.
Incentive pay, does that work? Good idea, bad idea?
It depends how you're using it. So in Mesquite, Texas, we've started what we call the ETIP program. It's an Excellence in Teaching Incentive Program. It's intended to keep the teacher in the classroom, and it's based on a value add component, very much like a university setting. And right now, teachers go through 2 years of extensive training in Mesquite. That's actually accredited by the Texas A&M system. That training then, using a rubric system for evaluation, results in them getting a $5,000 pay increase, and it changes their title. And we have 3 tiers of that. So by the time we're done, we're anticipating we're going to have 200 plus doctorates in our system. And those doctorates, though, are expected to add value in very specific ways to the system to improve the education of children. So I think using incentive pay based on test metrics is probably not a wise system. It's not a system I want to use.
I've never seen anybody game a test, have you?
No, never. I've never seen that. Not in Atlanta, not anywhere. Right. And so, you know, I think we've got to be careful about doing that. We've got to be careful also about assuming that the test is the greatest measure of how we're doing with our children. And we've seen the conversation around STAR testing in the state of Texas. If you haven't seen it, you need to pay attention. And about the readability levels and some of the work being done there. There's some considerable concern about what's been done with testing in the state of Texas. Well, I would argue we need to really move away from standardization and more individualization.
I want you to teach more English and how to communicate and get them off of these funny little things that they fool around with all the time.
Well, now I don't know
one last question to you. I know that's hard. I don't let them use it in my classroom, I can tell you that. About the study that you did, are there other factors such as unionization, other things that you found that let's just say influence those scores you came up with?
Yes, we took a look to see what factors seemed to be responsible that were related to how states did. The one factor that was strongest, that we had a fair amount of confidence in, was the strength of the teachers' unions in the state. And it turned out—
So I would assume the stronger the teachers' unions, the better the scores. Am I right?
No, you're not.
Not?
The stronger the teachers' union, the lower the scores. And it was really very strong impact. It was so strong that if you went from the weakest unions to the strongest unions, that would be the equivalent of the state dropping from like number 10 to number 40. It would cause a tremendous decline in terms of how the state did based on increased strength of unions. That was a very strong impact. I was surprised.
Yeah. How did you control for that? I mean, quickly.
It's something called regression analysis, and you take a look at several different factors. So you take a look at how much the state spends, which, by the way, spending had no relationship whatsoever to how well the states did. Now, what that meant, the way we interpret that is, obviously, if you spend too little, the system's not going to do a good job. But once you reach a certain point, it appears that spending more money doesn't lead to higher scores anymore on the students' parts. And most states appear to have already reached that point. So the states that spend additional money don't get higher scores. You control for that. You control for the number of students, the minorities. You control for some socioeconomic things. You control, we were looking at whether or not there were charter schools, how many students were in charter schools, the share of private school students in the state. So we had a bunch of different factors. The only one that was really powerful was the unionization.
Well, so David, I think I told you when I called you last weekend to tell you about this, I said you might learn something on this program too. Have you?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Texas is doing much better.
And we are unfortunately out of time. So I am happy that you made it from Iowa to here as quickly as you possibly could. Thank you for all the good work you're doing in Mesquite.
Thank you.
Thank you for all the good work you're doing and what you're up to at UTD and beyond. And depending upon how you now feel about taxes, school finance, and quality education in Texas, perhaps you might want to share your thoughts with your elected representatives or even your school board and administration. Check McCuistion TV for other important programs. Follow us on Twitter and keep inviting us in to talk about things that matter with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at nikkimcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.